This is a reading of the first edition of the Putnam printing of The Witch in the Wood by T.H. White. Then after the departing of King Ban and King Bors, King Arthur rode into Caerleon, and thither came to him Lot's wife of Orkney in a manner of a messenger. And she came richly beseen with her 4 sons, Gawain, Gabares, Agravain, and Gareth, with many other knights and ladies. And she was passing fair lady. Wherefore the king cast great love unto her, and so was Mordred born. And she was his sister on his mother's side, Igraine. So there she rested in her month, and at the last departed. Then the king dreamed a marvellous dream, whereof he was sore abread. But all this time King Arthur knew not that King Lot's wife was his sister. Thus was the dream of King Arthur. Him thought that there was come unto this land griffins and serpents, and him thought they burnt and slew all the people in the land, and then him thought he fought with them, and they did him passing great harm, and wounded him fully sore. Right so came by him Merlin, and saluted the king, and asked him why he was so pensive. I may well have been pensive, said the king, for I have seen the marvellous sight that I ever saw. That know I well, said Merlin, as well as thyself, and of all thy thoughts, but thou art but a fool to take thought, for it will not be amend thee. Also I know what thou art, and who was thy father, and of whom thou wert born. King Uther Pendragon was thy father, and had thee of Igraine. That is false, said King Arthur. How shouldest thou know it? Yes, said Merlin, I know it better than ye or any man living. And anon the king asked, No, he was born. And they told him that Uther Pendragon was his father, and Queen Igraine was his mother. Then he said to Merlin, I will that my mother be sent for, and that I may speak with her. And if she say to herself, then will I believe it. In all haste the queen was sent for, and she came, and the king welcomed Igraine in the best manner. Right so came Ulfus, and said openly, that the king and all might hear they were feasted that day. Ye are the falsest lady in all the world, and the most traitress unto the king's person. Beware, said Arthur, what thou sayest. Thou speakest a great word. I am well aware, said Sir Ulfus, what I speak, and here is my glove to prove it upon any man that will say to the contrary, and this Queen Igraine is causer of your great damage. For, and she would have uttered in the life of King Uther Pendragon of the birth of you, ye had never had half mortal wars that he had had. For the most part of your barons of your realm knew never whose son ye were, nor of whom ye were born. And she that bare you should have known openly in the excusing of her worship and yours, and in likewise to all the realm. Wherefore I prove her false to God, and to you, and to your realm, and to who will say the contrary I will prove it upon his body. Then spake Igraine, and said, I am a woman, and I may not fight, but rather that I should have dishonoured there would be some good man take my quarrel. More, she said, Merlin knoweth well, and ye, Sir Ulfus, know how King Uther came to me in the castle of Tintagel, in the likeness of my lord that was dead 3 hours to 4. And after my lord was dead, King Uther wedded me, and by his commandment, when the child was born, it was delivered unto Merlin, and nourished by him. And so I saw the child never after, nor wot not what his name, for I knew him never yet. And there was Ulfus said to the queen, Merlin is more to blame than ye. Well I wot, said the queen, that I bear a child by my lord King Uther, but I wot not where he is become. Then Merlin took the king by the hand, saying, This is your mother. Caithith and Nart gan cherith Siroshab, is Caithith asiart, na kete, behith sutbite. Part 1. Chapter 1. The land of Lothian and Orkney lies in the northern latitudes. It is a country of bog and mountain, where the wind whistles all day, and at night the turf fires glow with small flames in a kind of rusty saffron. The nearest neighbors live 10 miles apart, and the grouse say, "talk," and the wild merlins can be seen sweeping over the swelling lands in their pursuit of pipits and larks, and the white-bottomed wet-evers, which dodge into gorse bushes. It is all heather and loveliness, and the town people say, "Hey, yow, ain't it 'orrible? I can't bear them lonely places, no think in them. It's sort of melancholy, ain't it?" 500 years ago, in the land of Lothian, looked much as it does today. The castle which stands at the top of the tremendous Atlantic cliffs was in better repair, of course, and there were several Irish saints who lived in the beehives along the edge of the same cliffs, who are not there now. Although there were unicorns on the mountains and elks in the bogs, their antlers are still dug up sometimes by the peat cutters, because bogs are excellent for preserving things. But apart from these, and for a few Milesians and furblogs and so on, you might still be living in King Arthur's century if you visited Lothian tomorrow. So we may as well visit it now, in the hope of seeing a few sorcerers and an Irish saint or two, busily reciting 50 psalms in his beehive, and 50 in the open air, and 50 with his body plunged in cold water, which is what they habitually did. If we go, we shall find the saints all very crusty, and, as usual, and all, like true Irishmen, refusing to accept the date of Easter. We shall find their air full of gerfalcons and eagles, and a few high-flying dragons. We shall see the kilted people bouncing over the bogs, or going into battle with a holy manuscript in front of them, and perhaps we may have the luck to come across King Arthur himself, in flashing armor, or at any rate, some of the famous kings who ruled those ancient people, and whose history was bound up so closely with that of the son of Uther Pendragon. Everybody knows that King Arthur and the furblogs and the dyspeptic saints that were all living together in Mallory's day, and that it was not King Edward IV who was reigning them at that time, only there would have been a good deal of difficulty in coming across a saint in the ordinary parts of Britain at the time, except for the remote north or west. The ancient things always get pushed into the rims of civilization, towards the distant sea coasts, and the coast of Lothian was just such a place. It was the rim of the world, except for the Cassiterides. Now there were in Lothian 2 separate kinds of life. There was the village life, which went on cheerfully on the edge of the sea, and there was castle life, which went on in the huge fortress at the top of the sea cliffs. They met on few occasions. In the village there was the priest who was busy disputing Easter with the local saints, casting out devils, curing warts, scolding the population, dropping into stations with his parishioners, and behaving, in general, with the utmost sanctity in all directions. There was Mother Morland the fishwife, who frequently enjoyed what she called little drop of sunshine, and Pudicet, the landlord of such illicit shebeen, who kindly supplied her with the same. There were fishermen who enjoyed faction flights with the mountainy farmers on the market days, and children who chewed seaweed, and dogs which barked a lot, and a certain number of lobsters, crabs, cod, and shark whales mixed up with it all. The people were not particularly happy, like the tenants of Sir Ector, whom he met in the first book, but this was because of their master, King Lot of Lothian, was not exactly a happy man. There was a sort of atmosphere in the castle under which they lived, which reflected on the peasants. It was the atmosphere which Hamlet was talking about when he said there was something rotten in the state of Denmark. In spite of this feeling, you must not suppose that the people of Lothian were miserable in those days, or anything like that. They shared with those other tenants of Sir Ector, whom we have just mentioned, one feeling which kept them foreign to the heartlessness of the castle, and which must make them absolutely incomprehensible to human beings today. They believed in God. Nobody is stupid enough to believe in God nowadays, or only in the outlandish places like Ireland or Rome, or else in feeble, straining Protestant kind of way, like people at a performance of Peter Pan trying hard to believe in Tinker Bell. Lord, I believe we say, help thou our unbelief. The fisher people of King Lot's village believed in God without any effort of this sort, without having to be helped. They were of the opinion Sir James Jeans, who says that if a monkey were set down at a typewriter, he would eventually resurrect and write all the plays of Shakespeare, given it time enough to work through other combinations of letters. And what is time in eternity? King Lot's villagers, thinking along these lines, saw nothing improbable about the resurrection of the body, or one exactly like it. And since they knew that God was almighty, and much better than a monkey, they found no difficulty in supposing that he could count the sparrows, or take a personal interest in them, and in their queen, Morgause. It seemed to them hardly anything of a feat compared with arranging the heavens, and the times and spaces familiar to Sir James Jeans. The result of this dark superstition was that the people who lived in Lothian were always bringing God into the conversation. "God bless this house and all in it," they would say, urgently, when they went to visit each other, and when one of them referred to his departing mother, he would always remember to add, "God be good to her," as if he really meant it. When they went fishing on a good fishing day, they used to remark, "We shall get a fish today, please God." And another result of people's laughable ignorance was a kind of reality in the village, which was not to be met within the castle. There were Lothians who got drunk and said funny things, and picked up bits of lead or iron to keep off the fairies, and told each other splendid stories at night, and said, "Whatever," and "in it," and behaved, in some, in a way which was true to themselves. Taking it by and large, a person could have done worse than to live in a village we are talking about. For one thing, it was delightful to see all the dragons and banshees and sorcerers and saints, who were all as busy as bees, pinching themselves and staying awake all night to spite themselves, and writing illuminated manuscripts with the most charming serpents in the margins. So much for the real people who lived in Lothian then. But there were some upper classes as well. The king of the grimly castle which looked down upon them was Lot. And it is with him, and with his wife Queen Morgause, and with their 4 children, Gawain, Agravain, Gareth, and Gareth, that the second volume is intended to be concerned. King Lot was not a pleasant man. He used to beat his children when he was in a temper, explaining that he always used to be flogged in his young days, and look at the man he was now. He would not allow a licensed public house in Lothian village, of which place he was more than a magistrate would be today. And at the Battle of Bedegraine, it was he who suggested that the deserters should be shot for cowardice, which he pronounced in military manner to rhyme with mice. In short, he was the sort of man who would be retired general in the 20th century. Perhaps his worst sin was that he was getting fat. Lot was not a charmer, but then he might have been worse. Kind readers will remember that a great deal of him was due to his gout, and to the difficulty of living with his wife. He was true to his own standards, such as they were. And one might perhaps say about him that the cowboys are supposed to say in American saloons, "Don't shoot the piano player, he's doing his best." At any rate, it was not the king who created the queer atmosphere in Lothian. It was his wife, Queen Morgause. The Queen of Lothian had been one of the lovely Cornwall sisters. At one time they had inclined towards being called the Pearls of Penzance, but after they got married they had reverted to the former title because it threw an emphasis on their sisterhood, thus driving a wedge between themselves and their husbands. There were 3 of them in it, Morgause, Elaine, and Morgan le Fay. Their father was the Earl of Cornwall, who got killed in the Battle of Uther Pendragon, when Uther wanted to marry the Countess of Cornwall himself. It is difficult to know how to begin explaining about Morgause. She was a witch, for one thing, and there was a strong vein of necromancy in her family. Morgause did not have the witchcraft as badly as her sister Morgan le Fay, and what she did have was in a different way, for she only used her spells to preserve her beauty. For instance, the unfortunate retainers of the castle used to be terrified by meeting her in the night time with a face which had apparently turned into mud. And sometimes they would come across her during the quiet hours, walking about with a ghastly white mask tied on with bows, or with a sort of bleary Chinese expression that shone like greased ivory. She was a sort of fashionable witch, who achieved her terrors by means of simples, unguments, and supernatural brews, which she studied in an uncanny book of charms which Morgan had got for her out of the future, called Vague. None of this has begun to give us an idea of the Queen's character. Perhaps the best thing would be to say that she was a victim of her imagination, the center of her universe and the ruler of her family. She had married Lot for his money and position, and her two sisters were married to two other kings. Elaine had Nentries of Garlet, and Morgan Le Fay had Uriens of Gore. One important thing about the sisters is what we have mentioned, that their father had been killed by Arthur's father, who subsequently married their mother, Igraine. It is only one of the important things. The other thing is the Queen's character. Perhaps a modern psychologist would have explained her by saying that she lived in an imaginary world. The people of Lothian only noticed that she did not live in their own world, and so they called her a witch. Finally, there are 4 boys in the high castle. Gawain, who was the eldest of them, and had the reddest hair, was about 14. Gareth, who was the youngest and fairest, was 9. And they were all 4 quite wild. Gawain was passionate, Agravain was sulky, Gareth was stupid, and Gareth was a deer. Their mother's character had 2 effects on them while they were small, the one good, the other bad. The good effect was that she was so selfish and cared so little for them that they were allowed to run wild, thus drawing quite a lot of niceness and reality out of the simple people in the village below. The bad effect was that, as she treated them like lapdogs when she did notice them, they behaved like lapdogs toward her. They adored her and starved for her love. At dinner in the evenings of Lothian, the pipers used to march around and around the dining tables, making an infernal din, and the king and queen used to quarrel across any guests who happened to be visiting the country. They had a fine long-standing quarrel about some cooks and cuckoos, which was incomprehensible to anyone but themselves, and which went very well with the pipes. One evening, with a certain Earl Ubowis was staying with them, a small piece of conversation came through the music during a lull. "What's the latest news about this fellow Arthur?" shouted the Earl. "Upstart!" yelled the king. "I beg your pardon? I said he was an upstart." "Oh, an upstart. Oh, yes, of course. One of these jumped-up gentry. But I thought," squealed the Earl, after thinking about it, "that because he pulled the sword out of the stone, he had to be the son of Uther Pendragon." "Who was his mother, then?" "Well, if you put it like that." And the king proceeded to explain to his guest at the top of his voice that he and 5 other kings had revolted against Arthur because of their doubts. The other 5 were called Nentries of Garloth, Uriens of Gore, Carados of the Dolorous Tower, the king of Scotland, and the king with the 100 knights. There had been what Lot called a bit of a skirmish, from which he had withdrawn according to plan, and now he was considering a general engagement. At this point a positive St. Bartholomew on the Chauncers put a stop to further conversation, and the king and queen reverted to their own concerns. The children had been sent to bed, so they were out of the way, and, as for the Earl Ubowitz, when their quarrel reached a difficult pitch, they had only to offer him another helping of something or other to keep him quiet. He had 6 helpings of Syllabub. Certainly there was a streak of obliquity in the feeling of the castle of Lothian, but you must not suppose that the place was in every way unhappy. When the king was home, at all events, There was that lovely old Gaelic bustle which people find difficult to picture nowadays if they are just looking at the bare stones. The place was a town in itself, a busy node of the lonely and ancient and savage north. There were old wives spinning, and milkmaids churning, and bards composing, and turf boys keeping the fireboxes full of sods, and pump boys looking after the water supply, and housemaids carrying wool, and butchers salting down meat for the winter, and carpenters, plowmen, tinkerers, cowboy, drovers, thatchers. The lantern swung to and fro across the courtyards before the darkening dawns and under the wild northern lights. Nothing can ever entirely be wrong in the land of Gael, and, as the poet Agdrin O. Rathael had put it, there were companies coming to the famous mansion without sorrow, companies falling down with feverish pulse, companies inebriate without offense to their neighbors, companies of pride discoursing uproariously, a fragrant odor issuing in strength from the tender breath of the triumphant band, swift, continuous currents from the nostrils of the nobles who want to hold the battlefield. Airs being played harmoniously on harps, the wise and learned reading histories, in which an account was faultlessly given of the clergy and of each great family that arose in Europe. Meat on spits and wild fowl from the ocean, music and song, drinking bouts, delicious roast meat and spotless honey, hounds and dogs, and baying. King Lot lived by the sword, and held the power of life and death over all this grandeur. He had an old and rusty repeating hook, which was the laird's badge of office. There was something holy or horrible about it. He had only to lend it to a stranger, even to an Englishman or a Paynim, for that man to be inviolable so long as he carried it through ancient Lothian. That was the sort of place it was. That concludes Chapter 1 of The Witch in the Wood. This book long!